In the early 12th century, an English deacon, known as Henry of Huntingdon, was commissioned to write a history of England, spanning all the way from prehistoric times to the then current. When he arrived in his grand narrative to the curious case of the Monument of Gigantic Stones in Salisbury Plain, known to us today as Stonehenge, he frankly didn't have much to say, as there was essentially nothing known about these stones at the time. In fact, he was quite honest about this, writing, quote, "Stones of wonderful size have been erected after the manner of doorways, so that the doorway appears to have been raised upon doorway, and no one can conceive how such great stones have been raised aloft, or why they were built there." End quote. Only a decade later, however, Geoffrey of Monmouth, who we've actually already encountered in this series before, as he's the one who essentially created the modern Arthurian legend, was more than happy to fabricate a whole mythology of Stonehenge in his typical creative style, including that the stones were brought from Africa by giants, then turned into a monument to the defeat of invading Saxons, with a little help from Merlin, the wizard of Arthurian legend. For many centuries, historians didn't do much better. In the 7th century, the architect Inigo Jones described Stonehenge as a Roman temple, for the simple reason that the Romans were the only civilization he knew of with the technological sophistication to build such massive structures. After all, the smaller blue stones, still weighing several tons each, were apparently transported hundreds of miles from Wales, and the larger sarsen stones, though traveling a smaller distance, were still quarried and sculpted many miles away and then carried to the site. No small feat for stones weighing 20 to 30 tons each. Today we know that, in actuality, building at Stonehenge began sometime in the 3rd century BC. So, far from being built by the Romans, it was actually as ancient to the Romans as the Romans are to us. The reason so many have struggled to understand this site is that it is both massively impressive and completely mysterious. There is not a single piece of contemporary or even near contemporary written evidence relating to it, and so we are left only with scattered bits of archaeological evidence, all of which point to it being an incredibly important site for these Neolithic peoples over many centuries, but nothing which can answer the fundamental question: why did they build it? There are theories, sure. The stones appear to be aligned to the trajectory of the sun on the summer solstice, prompting some to consider it a form of calendar or star map. There's plenty of human remains around, though less than you'd expect given how long it was apparently in use, and usually these remains are cremated elsewhere and then buried in containers, prompting the idea that Stonehenge was nothing more than a sacred burial ground. A bit of kicking the can down the road, if you ask us. And there are the wacky Graham Hancock-style theories that they were built by aliens or the lost Atlantis civilization or whatever. But the reason there is space for such kooky theories about Stonehenge and other ancient megalithic sites like Göbekli Tepe, which is actually twice as old as Stonehenge, if you can believe that, is that fundamentally, despite all our progress, we do not know why they were built. Anyone who pretends otherwise is not being honest. There are some things we can say with relative certainty, but a unified theory remains elusive, and possibly forever will. Which brings us to Elden Ring's Divine Towers. These are, in all likelihood, the most ancient structures in all the lands between. There is essentially no textual or documentary evidence about them. No item description refers to their original use. No character describes them or even refers to them. They truly are the massive ancient elephants in the room. On top of all that, they are bafflingly aniconic, which is to say, even though the structures themselves are adorned with impressive stonework, these symbols mean next to nothing to us, with very few exceptions. No words, no interpretable symbols, no pictures. But we can't just let that slide. No self-respecting, pretend video game archaeologist could. The opportunity to investigate these impressive and mysterious structures is too good to pass up, even if we admittedly have our work cut out for us. We may not be able to decipher Stonehenge anytime soon, but by God, we will figure out the Divine Towers. Along the way, we must be careful not to repeat Inigo Jones's mistake, and to eagerly attribute them to the most convenient ancient culture just because they're both old. Instead, we must let them tell their own story. And what a story it is. So, here we go, with some good old-fashioned Tarnished Archaeology. Let us start with the basics. The first thing to clarify is that the Divine Towers are clearly distinct from the bridges which connect them to the mainland. We've gone to great lengths in prior episodes describing these, but suffice it to say for now that these bridges belong to the Saint and Tree stratum, the same one as Stormvale Castle and the Fortified Manor, as you can see from the clearly distinct masonry and iconography. So for now, we can just restrict our analysis to the actual towers. The most important point to make here is that the Divine Towers are clearly the older of the two structures, both stylistically, as we'll get into in a bit, but also because it wouldn't make any sense to build the Divine Bridges if there weren't already Divine Towers there. So the Divine Towers are older even than the Divine Bridges, which date to the Saint and Tree Empire. There is also the matter of the amorphous, unworked rock, which covers a single face of each of the Divine Towers. Something we will return to in depth later, but here we'll just say its presence clearly indicates that the Divine Towers are older than the bridges, because whatever process caused this feature on the Divine Towers happened before the bridges were built. This is basic stratigraphy, like, for example, the layer of volcanic ash from the cataclysmic eruption of Thera, modern-day Santorini, that is attested to in records from far-flung places like Egypt and even China, and helps us date multiple digs from around the entirety of the Mediterranean. Or perhaps an even more relevant example would be the KT boundary, the geologic evidence of the meteor impact that ended the reign of the dinosaurs. But we'll come to that point in a bit. Point is, it's a boundary, a dividing line. There's the pre-Thera layers and the post-Thera layers. And in Elden Ring, the Divine Towers are among the only pre-Cataclysm structures in the entire Lands Between. Essentially nothing else bears this mark, attesting to how inconceivably old they really are. The masonry of the Divine Towers is impressive, intricately carved from giant slabs of rock and fitted together perfectly without mortar, in large single pieces indicating a megalithic technology. It's an immense amount of work to cut and dress giant stones like this, such that they fit together without mortar. When the ancient Greeks, for example, came across structures with such finely dressed large stones, they called it Cyclopean masonry, because they believed only a giant or a cyclops would have the strength to build such things. As we'll see later on, this parallel is quite on point. The Divine Towers are monumental structures, for sure. Beyond that, the Divine Towers are covered in intricate carvings. It's a bit like Angkor Wat in our world. The entire thing is carved, every face, every vertex, and each intricately carved in situ, which definitely indicates both an advanced and also a peculiar society. Later structures, like the Divine Bridges, use stone bricks and mortar, a much more typical approach, and then adorn them with freestanding statues. Not so in the Divine Towers. All their carvings are in situ, speaking to the skill and man-hours of craftsmanship involved. And speaking of these carvings, they are, as we alluded to before, bizarrely aniconic. That is to say, while there is no shortage of beautiful designs, for the most part these designs are not immediately meaningful to our eyes. There are no pictures or scenes or figures except some vaguely serpentine shapes, much less anything resembling a proper script. What this conveys, from the point of view of the developer, is an impossibly old and foreign society, such that their symbols mean next to nothing to us. Once again, it's more than a bit like Stonehenge. impossibly old, and tantalizingly mysterious. As we proceed from the exterior to the interior of the tower, we can see the embedded star effect similar to what we see in the Eternal Cities. And likewise, the elevator uses a similar gravity magic for its function, much like, for example, the Schiefer River well. So there's some celestial connotation to these towers, no doubt. But it's not until we get atop the tower itself that things start to come together a bit. In simplest terms, the space atop the towers appears to be a Hieron, the sacred space for the god. But which god? Well, in 5 of the 6 towers, we see dendrified two fingers sitting atop a small mound of earth, enclosed in a circular ring construction of unknown function. And it is here that we have our sole piece of textual evidence about the towers. A single shred which comes from the description of the Great Runes before they are activated, which states they are, quote, devoid of any benediction, end quote. So presumably that's what the fingers were doing up here. They were offering benediction with or to the power of Great Runes. Anyone with knowledge of religious history will find this very familiar. The notion of ascending to a sacred, elevated space to receive a ritual blessing goes all the way back to the ancient Mesopotamians, whose kings and priests would ascend their stupendously tall ziggurats to commune with the gods. One such ziggurat in Babylon, by the way, is likely the inspiration for the biblical story of the Tower of Babel, just to give you a sense of how impressed contemporaries were with its scale. And speaking of the Bible, think of Moses receiving the 10 Commandments atop Mount Sinai, or the Prophet Muhammad receiving his first revelation in a mountain cave. There is something quite fundamental about ascending to a physically higher space to receive the divine blessing. But there's a problem with this simple story because the description on the Great Runes clearly refers to the most recent stratum of Divine Tower usage, in the era of the Erd Tree and the Two Fingers, long after the Divine Towers were initially built. As we've established, the Divine Towers are likely the oldest structure in all the lands between, certainly older than the Erd Tree. So they must have been repurposed for Great Rune benediction, and this description is unfortunately not useful in determining their original purpose. Presumably it wasn't always the two fingers here atop the towers, so what was? If we take a closer look at the circular structure surrounding the small mound of earth upon which the fingers sit, we can recognize this design. It is replicated elsewhere, specifically in the sealed tunnel on the way to the West Altus Divine Tower. And there, instead of surrounding near Earth, it is encasing a meteorite. We know it's a meteorite because we see the falling star beasts and other impact craters throughout the world have this exact same visual depiction. This seems as good a place as any to shout out a Redditor, NamelessSinger, who we've actually mentioned before in our Eternal City of Lanedale episode, who had a fantastic analysis many months ago on these topics, including covering several of the points we will discuss today. Whoever this person is, they have the eye of an archaeologist, and you all should definitely read their posts. Returning to the Divine Towers, perhaps the similarity of design between the Tower Hieron and the sealed tunnel indicates that, originally, instead of the two fingers, there was a meteorite atop the towers. And, sure enough, elsewhere atop the towers, indeed we see a repeating pattern of circular designs encasing meteorite fragments, arranged in a deliberate and totemic manner. And in the interior of the tower we can see much of the same. So here, without too much of a leap, we can make our first conclusion about the towers. They were built to worship, and likely harness the power of, meteorites. We have precious little to go on in terms of iconography in analyzing the Divine Towers. So this one pattern of small meteorites encircling a larger meteorite is indeed of potentially monumental significance in understanding why the Divine Towers were built as they are, and where they stand. FromSoft's clues are mysterious, sure, but they often are surprisingly heavy-handed too. Once noticed, they often repeat, and are shown to us gratuitously again and again. And so it is with the encircling meteorite motif seen on the towers, in an almost fractal form. The small meteorites embedded in the masonry are encircled by reliefs of small crater-like concavities. Together, these meteorites encircled a large singular meteorite that was the centerpiece of each Divine Tower, currently beneath the mound that the two fingers and one discarded corpse now rest upon. And zooming out yet again, the meteors of the Divine Towers themselves encircle one giant geological depression, the now inundated Central Sea. This simple reframing helps to explain their circumferential positioning on the map, something that has been noted by various internet sleuths since early after the game's release. They seem to be built around a central structure, or at least have some central reference point. Their center of gravity, however, is mysterious. Many have hypothesized it as the center of a future DLC, or perhaps something even more mysterious. But now that we know they were built to harness the power of meteorites, and after seeing the motif of smaller meteorites encircling a larger central one, the meteorites that the Divine Towers hold like settings for a jewel, the simplest interpretation is, well, the Divine Towers were built around the site of an even larger ancient meteorite impact. If we take a look at the map, well, that notion begins to come together. The Central Sea is an impact crater, something which is evident in the map design, but even more clearly seen in the concept art of the map, which shows the sheer cliffs and circular basin characteristic of an impact crater, allowing for subsequent asymmetric erosion. This concept art is actually uncannily similar to the Gulf of Mexico. Not coincidentally, the site of the impact event just off the coast of the Yucatan Peninsula that produced the KT boundary we mentioned previously and led to the extinction of the dinosaurs 66 million years ago. That impact crater was discovered in large part due to a gravity anomaly caused by fragmented rocks under the crater. As we know, the link between meteors, impact events, and gravity anomalies is certainly nothing new in Elden Ring. So presumably the Divine Towers were built to commemorate and worship the arrival of one particular meteor, as we'll see shortly, but that does not mean the impacts stopped happening. Indeed, all throughout the Lands Between today, we can see evidence of quite recent, though smaller, impact events. From the Falling Star Beast impact craters to the strewn fields of meteorites in the Weeping Peninsula and the Altus Plateau. Not to mention, however, the Estelles arrived and Radon's meteor. The Lands Between is basically a meteor magnet, and many of these strewn fields and impactites are likely responsible for the odd geologic features of the Lands Between, like the glintstone deposits of Liurnia, but those are stories for another day. For now, let's just say that this notion helps to explain the amorphous rock on the sides of the Divine Towers that we've previously mentioned. This is such an important feature to the developers that it's on every Divine Tower. It's in the concept art of the Divine Towers. It's even on their map icons. The developers clearly want to show us something with this rock sludge, What it really looks like, if you compare it across all the divine towers, is liquefied rock, aka lava, that cooled in place on the sides of the towers. You might think these are simply ejecta from an impact event, which once cooled is known as tektite, but they do not mark a geometrically consistent face of the divine towers, meaning it did not come, apparently, from a single source. In simplest terms, what all this means is that there was a time after the divine towers were built that something liquefied vast amounts of rock, which then cooled and hardened on the towers. And, as it happens, large impact events can do exactly that. There was even a time period in Earth's history, known as the Late Heavy Bombardment, during which the rate of impact events on Earth and the rest of the inner solar system is thought to have vastly increased. It is believed that this event occurred after the Hadean Eon, during which the Earth's crust was molten liquid, so by that time there was a proper crust, but this barrage of heavy impacts actually re-liquefied most of the Earth's crust. Now, in real geological time, this occurred before conditions became conducive to life on Earth. But as we'll detail in upcoming episodes, Elden Ring fuses geological and evolutionary timescales quite often. FromSoft have used geological terms directly in the narrative, for example, with the Silurian and Ordovician periods being used as names for Crucible Knights. Quite fitting, as these were a geological era of biological abundance and diversity. In the resulting combined narrative, prehistoric and even pre-biological eons are given life, faces, and stories, while tectonic and celestial events become plot drivers for the characters, as literally the stars command fate, according to the Amber Starlight Shard description. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. We will explore the merging of geological and evolutionary times at length in future episodes. Here let's stick to the first geological eon, the Hadean Age, named after Hades, the fiery mythological underworld of the Greeks. If we allow for some magical creativity here, the late heavy bombardment of the Hadean Age and the reliquefaction of the Earth's crust is just the type of event that could cause the amorphous rock splatter on the divine towers. This notion is quite helpful, as we will see, for explaining several other mysterious features of the lands between. Now that we have some sense of what the towers are, we can address the remaining core mysteries, echoes of the questions that have perplexed experts on Stonehenge and Göbekli Tepe in our own world for generations. Who were these people? Why did they worship this specific site, this specific impact event? And finally, if they weren't worshiping the Greater Will and the Two Fingers, what were they worshiping? Well, let's return to the sanctum atop the towers for answers. As we can see, around the embedded meteorite fragments, there is a characteristic design, which is our best clue, a fingerprint of sorts of the civilization that built these towers. Just as we've done with libation statues and tree reliefs in the past, we can use this to map out this civilization. As has been pointed out before, and once again let's shout out NamelessSinger for being among the first to do so, this design, with 8 circles arranged around a central sphere, is the signature of the fell god, as best seen in his massive eye embedded in the torso of the fire giant. It also happens to be based on an image of polar cyclones on Jupiter's surface, but in-game it is seen in a variety of places. Atop the divine towers, on the fell god's eye, and also on the giant's fire pan, on the troll's hammer, on the giant's flame fire pots, on the curiously repurposed stone bridge leading to the mountaintops. It's even a tattoo you can select when making your character. So it is clearly a symbol of great importance to the developers and to the in-game story, even if its different variants suggest some evolution of the symbol over the time period it was used. Thus, we follow these clues and take our first leap in suggesting that it was the fell god of the giants that was initially worshipped in the Divine Towers. To be more specific, they seem to be commemorating the actual site of arrival of the fell god, which is related to meteorites. An odd connection at first, but if we take a step back, that begins to make a bit more sense. The giants, or more likely their predecessors, the Titans as some have called them, but we'll just call them the ancient giants, built the Divine Towers to commemorate the arrival of their god. And it was these ancient giants that built the forge and discovered the art of smithing, once considered divine according to the Troll's hammer. This is basically Elden Ring's Prometheus story, the story of how fire was gifted to the inhabitants of the lands between, and with it, all of the attendant gifts of civilization. There is a reason Miyazaki's Dark Souls cosmogony, which is essentially an allegory for the birth of civilization, begins with fire. Fire equals civilization. The use of fire, initially to cook meat, then later to burn down forests for hunting, and much later to forge tools and weapons, is one of the main distinguishing features between humans, including Homo sapiens and Homo erectus, and other apes. It's no coincidence that pretty much every known culture has a god of fire and a god of smithing. Often they're even the same god. In Hesiod's Theogony and subsequent treatments, Prometheus was the Greek titan who stole the power of fire from the gods and gifted it to humanity, incurring the wrath of Zeus in the process. Fundamentally, this is a story about how humanity acquired the gifts of civilization, starting with fire, but also the arts and craftsmanship, and most of all, smithing. Its fundamental nature helps explain its enduring allure as a story. Elden Ring's Prometheus figure is the fell god, who gifted the power of fire to the ancient giants. The ancient giants then invented smithing, built their massive forge, and built a civilization using these new arts. No surprise then that they revered the power of meteorites atop the Divine Towers. As all of you know by now, most iron and many other early metals were originally sourced from meteorites, before the advent of smelting, which allowed the extraction of iron from ore and heralded the Iron Age. It's not like there weren't any iron tools before the Iron Age. Actually, there were, including spear tips from Egypt from over 2,000 years before the Iron Age proper. But they were rare because they were sourced from meteorites. So a fell god of flame and of smithing would no doubt be associated with this precious meteoric source of metals. But one of the implications of this story that we're telling here is that it would suggest that the ancient giants were not only so sophisticated as to build these towers and worship the fell god, but they also had control over basically the entire lands between, not just the mountaintops, as we see the Divine Towers in the center of the map, not just localized to the north. This is surprising to say the least. Currently, there's only one fire giant, a relic of a lost era, and he sure doesn't seem capable of such civilizational heights. Not to mention, we are told that the giants were localized to the mountaintops, at least in more recent times. So, do we have any evidence that this is the case? Of some grand and totally lost civilization of ancient giants that span the entire lands between? As it turns out, yes. Tons and tons and tons. You know, for a channel dedicated to excavating the lands between, we really have gotten away with ignoring one giant, pervasive feature. Everywhere, all throughout the lands, if you know where to look, hidden in subterranean caverns and occasionally exposed by the erosive forces of time, lie the ruins of a vast and forgotten civilization. And when we say everywhere, we mean everywhere. From the southern reaches of Limgrave and the Weeping Peninsula, to the northern mountaintops of the giants. From the rune-strewn precipice in Liurnia to the Caelid wastes. And while they are certainly less monumental and more practical in nature than the Divine Towers, they are clearly built by the same civilization, as they have the same columnar geometry, the same style of masonry, even many of the same carvings on the columns. So here we have our evidence of a lost civilization of ancient giants. In the mountaintops, where the density of these ruins is likely the highest, surely no coincidence, by the way, there is a site of grace surrounded by these ruins, simply called the Ancient Snow Valley Ruins. So maybe we're supposed to call them the Ancient Ruins. But we here at Tarnished Archaeology prefer to call this the Builder Stratum, because wherever you find them, they are literally underpinning the Earth itself. Take for example the High Road Cave, where an unassuming cave entrance gives way to a vast subterranean cavern that is, oddly enough, not naturally formed. It's a man-made cavern, and the pillars and arches that support the cavern are unambiguously from this builder stratum. Or take instead the rune-strewn precipice. What is at first glance a natural cliff face is again a massive structure underpinned by builder stratum arches and pillars. In the places where we do find these features more exposed, it is clearly the result of erosion of the overlying earth. Take, for example, the exposed ruins in Radon's Arena. Clearly the arches that were once contiguous and part of a much larger structure, but now only the scattered and broken pillars remain. Much like seeing a Roman forum today, one has to imagine what it looked like when it still had walls and a roof. Point is, at each of these locations where you will find these structures, they seem to have been supporting the Earth itself. This likely explains one little mystery that had puzzled us for some time. Why is the Weeping Peninsula called a peninsula when it is clearly an island? Well, if you look at the ruins in the straits between the peninsula and Limgrave, the same structure spans both sides, and has the distinct orientation of a shared structure, indicating that, at some point, there was a connection between Limgrave and the Weeping Peninsula, which subsequently collapsed to expose these ruined structures. And if there was a connection, well, then that's a real peninsula, so it seems to have been correctly named after all. The immense reach and technological sophistication of these structures indicate a powerful and expansive civilization that covered the entire lands between at its height. They were so advanced that they even crafted massive automatons as guardians, the so-called golems, powered by fire like Hephaestus's automatons from Greek myth. There's a heap of them outside the Limgrave Divine Tower. There's one we fight as a boss in the High Road Cave, a builder stratum structure as we've just discussed. We can find a cluster of them on the bridges to Limgrave's tower, and there's both animate and inanimate versions in high concentration in the mountaintops. Point is, you tend to find them around the Divine Towers or builder stratum structures, so we know they are associated with this ancient giant civilization. This is no doubt the civilization referenced in their halberd, which reads, quote, "A great halberd of black stone crafted by a civilization now gone to ruin," end quote. So not only were they great builders and smiths, but they also crafted guardian golems with their impressive technologies. Which brings us to the question of why all of the structures of the builder stratum are now subterranean or exposed subterranean. One possibility is that these impressive builders literally built the earth alongside these structures, like a riff on the Norse Ymir, whose body was used to build the world, which itself is just one of many mythological narratives that follow this template. In the Enuma Elish, for example, written thousands of years before the Norse Eddas, the body of the god Tiamat is broken up to form the various features of the world. So there's a mythological trope across many cultures of ancient titans forming the world itself. Another possible explanation is that they were simply great tunnelers and burrowed through the lands between during their heyday, though we don't have any independent evidence of this. But we prefer a different explanation. Remember the amorphous sludge of solidified rock on the Divine Towers? Well, as we proposed, this may reflect a period of crust remelting after the Divine Towers were built. And a similar process could be reflected in the current buried status of the builder structures. Whatever sea of molten rock that partially covered the Divine Towers, as tall as they are, would have covered the entirety of the rest of the builder stratum, and left it in the subterranean state that it is. It's not a testable hypothesis, of course, but we'd bet that if you drilled a hole anywhere in the lands between, you'd find these types of ruins. They are simply the remains of an ancient civilization that was covered after an impact event reliquefied the crust and killed off its inhabitants. And if we look at the Forge of the Giants, a structure which shares many of the same aniconic designs as the Divine Towers, and rests atop clear builder stratum columns, meaning they belong to this ancient giant civilization, we can see that the same amorphous solidified rock is all over the support structure of the forge. This tells us two important things. For one, again, the developers really wanted to make this feature clear, which is why every builder stratum structure, including the Divine Towers, and even their map icons, has it. And two, whatever event caused this was not some local phenomenon. It wasn't just some eruption or local impact. This same feature is present on the Divine Towers in the south and the Forge in the north. It is present everywhere in the lands between. Whatever cataclysm reliquefied the crust affected this entire world. And just like the KT boundary or the Thera eruption layer, this cataclysm helps us to date the prehistory of the lands between. So now let's summarize everything we've learned so far and propose a timeline. Long into its prehistory, meteorites began impacting the lands between. One of those meteorites presumably heralded the arrival of the fell god. The impact crater of this event brought the magical energy of meteorites, the fire of the fell god. Its strewn field provided a near limitless source of material for metalworking, and its impact site formed the crater which would eventually become the Central Sea. The ancient giants built the Divine Towers around the site of this main impact crater, which at this stage would look something like a gigantic version of the meteorite impact craters being mined in several locations in-game. Meteorite fragments were used as talismans throughout the towers, and with their newfound skills of civilization, chief among them smithing, they built the builder stratum structures throughout the lands between during this period of dominance. Their reign was ended ultimately by another great impact cataclysm, like the Late Heavy Bombardment, which reliquefied the world's crust, causing the characteristic amorphous features on the Divine Towers and the Giant's Forge, and likely bringing an end to the reign of the ancient giants. Of course, once again, it's hard to definitively prove this, but given all of the ancient giant skulls we find throughout the mountaintops and in Caelid, these ancient giants were likely embedded into stone the same way that their structures were during this great cataclysm. This would explain why we always find them embedded into the bedrock, not quite fossilized, but simply embedded, and in a similar manner no matter where you find them, suggesting an acute global cataclysm. Just like the impact event that caused the KT boundary and ended the reign of the dinosaurs, after which only tiny mammals burrowing in holes survived the ensuing catastrophe, our ancestors, by the way. In Elden Ring, it seems that when the reign of the ancient giants ended, only their tiny puny cousins, still quite gigantic to us, survived. The colossal meteorite deposit, like that of the Yucatan event, becomes covered by newly reliquefied and then solidified Earth. its magical powers still dense in the soil. And if you've watched some of our previous videos, you know what we think happened after reliquefied Earth covered this site with cosmically fertile soil. Something in that soil grew to be quite great indeed. In between then and now come geological and historical eons with many wars and subsequent impact events, including those which separated Caelid from the mountaintops and caused the formation of the Central Sea, as shown in concept art, in reality an eroded impact crater lake, somewhat analogous to the Yucatan crater under the Gulf of Mexico. And in a creatively exaggerated version of the gravitational anomalies over the Yucatan crater, gravity above the Central Sea is slightly off. This is witnessed in water flows and the fact that the sea level is not quite what it is in other parts of the map, creating a strange sea cataract where two sea levels meet. With the subsequent impact events and the motion they form in geological and evolutionary time, in Elden Ring the motion of the stars has moved the fate of many, including, of course, those puny cousins of the ancient giants that ultimately meet their own end, in time by the genocidal hand of Queen Marika, summarily executed by the swords made of thorns, after they had already surrendered to the mighty new power of the Erd Tree. But that, our friends, is a story for another day.